Hello and welcome to Chalk Talk, the Pro Football Focus DFS podcast. I am your host, Scott Barrett, and manning the co-pilot seat is Tyler Buecher. Tyler, what's going on?
What's happening, Scott? Man, week five was brutal. We saw some crazy things happen in the NFL. Big Ben waving the white flag against Jacksonville. Who saw that coming? We saw some major disappointments at almost every position from a DFS perspective. A lot of our studs, Todd Gurley, Carlos Hyde, Evan Engram, Devontae Parker, they all failed to live up to the hype, either through injury or just poor performance. It was a rough week 5.
Right. I went all in on Dez Bryant. I had 100% ownership on both sites. So those 2 Cole Beasley touchdowns were pretty tilting, as well as him converting only 1 of 3 end zone targets, with the other 2 bouncing off of his hands. But still, it was a pretty nice week for me. I took down a GPP on DraftKings, so that was nice. A lot of Melvin Gordon by the end of the week. Had plenty of Hoyer, Garcon, and T.Y. Hilton stacks, so ended up being a profitable week for me. In general, are you just totally tilting your face off right now?
Yeah, and I'm like tripling my entries for this week 6, to make up for it. That's the only way to go back hard.
That's a sign of a true degenerate. But I like that. I like that you have more invested this week, so our listeners at home are going to know you're fully invested. You're researching your plays to the best of your ability, and hopefully we'll all be more profitable as a result. Tyler, let's start at a position I'm super on the fence about, maybe like 6 or 7 guys, and that's the quarterback position. Who are you looking at this week?
Oh, yeah, there's a lot of different options you can go as far as quarterback this week. From every price range, Tom Brady at the top at 8,300 on DraftKings, all the way down to Kevin Hogan at 4,600. I'll start at the bottom because I think Kevin Hogan is one of those cheap options where it's almost a plug and play for cash games. The Browns are a massive 10-point road dog. The game total has currently been rising since its initial release. It started at 44 points and is now currently up to 46.5. That just means the Browns will have more points to try to catch up in. What I really like is Kevin Hogan. He's a pretty accurate quarterback back from his days at Stanford. He finished his final collegiate season with a 67.8 completion percentage and a whopping 10.0 adjusted yards per attempt. That AS stat is like really, really amazing, to be honest. He's now entering his second year in the league, and I think he has a chance to just dink and dunk. Rashard Higgins has a really great matchup in the slot against Kareem Jackson, and we've seen Duke Johnson just go off week after week now as a receiving monster. Hogan's coming off a game where he completed 16 of 19 passes, just another game where he's showing off his high degree of accuracy, and he carries a lot of rushing upside. Last year he ran for 104 yards against the Bengals. That was on just 7 attempts. In his half of a game that he played last week, he took off 4 times, 30 rushing yards as well. And just keep in mind, for every 40 rushing yards, that's the equivalent to a passing touchdown. And I think that makes Hogan a very safe play given his price. He has a very high floor. And considering the Browns have the 6th highest passing play percentage, and they're going to be trailing, there's just reason after reason to target Hogan.
Yeah, I'm a little not really on Hogan. He did have that 104 rushing yard game, but wasn't really a prolific runner in college. Just about 320 so rushing yards every year of his college career. But like you said, he is super cheap. So especially in play on DraftKings, I'd say arguably not on FanDuel. I feel like this is where our listeners are going to turn us off and never listen to us again. But another cheap quarterback is Josh McCown. Dare I dream? Dare I, Tyler? He is up against a New England defense that's surrendering the most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. Since last season, they're allowing the most fantasy points per game over expectation. Maybe. And honestly, even in tournaments, I like Robbie Anderson a lot. He leads the team in deep targets and average depth of target by a pretty wide margin. And they're going to be trailing a lot in this game. New England's surrendering the most fantasy points per game on deep targets, the 4th most on intermediate targets. So he really could be in play this week. Brissett's in another good spot. He's cheap as well. I kind of like. I want to go back to the board with Carson Palmer. I mean, I feel like I'm going to tilt my face off when they give Adrian Peterson 20 carries at 2.8 yards a pop, but it just seems like such a dream match against this really porous Tampa Bay secondary.
Yeah, and they're just throwing so much. Like normally we want to target efficiency over volume with our quarterbacks, but when we're seeing a quarterback throw back 50 times a game, it takes it to a whole nother level. That pure volume it's not going to be fun to watch Carson Palmer, but at the end of the day, we're still going to get those pretty decent stat lines from him. I think he's in play this week as well. But like you said, I think you can get quarterbacks at every price range this week.
Yeah, they're leading the league in pass percentage, 71% of their plays. They're up against a Tampa Bay defense that ranks fourth best in yards per carry allowed, but ninth worst in opposing passer rating. Who are some other quarterbacks you're on?
I like Kirk Cousins. I like Deshaun Watson. Derek Carr, if he comes back from injury, I think is a good play at 5,900. That's pretty cheap. But one of my favorite plays, I think, is being a little contrarian and spending up at Tom Brady at 8,300. He's priced $1,000 more than the next highest quarterback on the main slate, who's Aaron Rodgers at 7,300. Brady carries that opponent ranking of 8th in bright red, which I think will deter some ownership, and he's currently carrying a questionable tag after suffering an injury to his non-throwing shoulder. We don't typically worry about ownership with quarterbacks, but I think these are reasons where we could see Brady come in lower owned than we should expect. And Brady always carries legit 3+ touchdown potential every single week. The Jets have allowed the 7th most passing touchdowns at the end of the season. That's despite 2 games allowing Jay Cutler and Blake Bortles to each throw 1 touchdown. So those are some outliers, but the Jets are allowing a lot of passing touchdowns. Yes, you're paying a lot for Brady, but you're paying for production, and you're paying for a quarterback that's thrown for 300+ yards in 4 consecutive games and has averaged 24.8 DraftKings points against the Jets over the last 2 years.
I like the Cousins call a lot, especially with Rob Kelly likely out. Samaje Perine has just been not good. We have Matthew Stafford in the Superdome, aka the Coors Field of NFL DFS. The Saints, since 2014, have surrendered 29.9 points per game to their opponents at home, but only 25.4 on the road. That's the largest differential over that span. If you want to pay up, you said Tom Brady, but I'm kind of on Deshaun Watson. He's just been crushing it. He leads all quarterbacks in fantasy points per game. He's up against a Browns defense that ranks second best in yards per carry allowed to running backs. So I don't think there's going to be a lot of work for Lamar Miller in this game. But the Browns rank dead last in opposing passer rating and dead last in pressure percentage, which is big for Watson considering that Houston's offensive line has been atrocious and also ranks last in the league in pass blocking efficiency. DeAndre Hopkins actually has a sneaky tough matchup. I think Jason McCourty shadows him in this contest. He shadowed A.J. Green a few weeks ago and held him in check. McCourty has actually been our highest rated cornerback this season. So I kind of like Ryan Griffin and Will Fuller as sneaky plays. What do you think about that, Tyler?
I really like it. Watson's just been crushing it this year. The only thing I think we're going to see is a lot of heavy ownership with him, especially after he went off for 5 touchdowns on national television last week, finishing as the highest scoring DraftKings points quarterback last week. I really like the ancillary plays there of Will Fuller, who's scored 2 touchdowns in back-to-back games, and Ryan Griffin, who I think could be a little bit of an oversight. Do you have any other quarterbacks you're interested in, or do you want to move on to the running back position?
Yeah, I want to pick because I'm undecided. I want to pick your brain on Matt Ryan. Is it a Matt Ryan week or a Devonta Freeman week?
I think it's a Devonta Freeman week for sure. We're seeing the Falcons running game really get going when they play at home. They are currently in 11.5 home favorite over the Dolphins. That is absurd. I just don't really see the ceiling that's worth chasing for Ryan if you're paying up that much. I don't think he nor Julio could be in for monster games. I like the matchup for Julio. I just don't know how much volume they're going to need in the second half. I think it's a Freeman week.
Right. Good arguments all around. I do like Julio Jones this week. with Mohamed Sanu likely out. That also pushes Taylor Gabriel into play. But like you said, volume can certainly be a concern. We saw against Green Bay them completely take their foot off the gas in the second half. I think Ryan attempted only 7 or 8 passes in the second half of that game. But nice segue, Tyler. Moving on to running backs, let's start with the chalk this week. And if you're playing on DraftKings, I'm fairly confident that's Mark Ingram.
Yeah, I couldn't agree anymore. After the trading of Adrian Peterson over to Arizona, we're going to see a lot more opportunities open up for both Ingram and teammate Alvin Kamara. I think Mark Ingram is the much safer play, and I'm finding it pretty interesting that the public seems to be leaning Kamara's way over Ingram. Outside of week 1, Ingram has outsnapped Kamara in every game. He's currently playing 52.9% of the snaps versus Kamara's 35.1%. Ingram has out-touched Kamara 57-30, seeing more touches in each consecutive game as the season has gone on. I think Ingram should be slotted in here for the majority of rushing opportunities, first and second down opportunities, and any goal line opportunities the team see.
Right. So Ingram is just egregiously priced on DraftKings. Actually, Kamara as well. They both rank outside of the top 35 running backs on DraftKings in terms of pricing. But in my actual opportunity article where I look at expected fantasy points, not even factoring into account the departure of Adrian Peterson, Ingram was my number 2 running back play, just in terms of volume he has been seeing and his price. In terms of expected fantasy points per game, Ingram ranks 19th, Kamara ranks 24th. If we evenly distribute Peterson's own expected fantasy points per game, and I don't think it's an even distribution, I think Ingram's going to get the majority of that, Ingram moves up to 15th at the position to 17th. And I think there's reason to expect that to improve as the season goes on as well, because the Saints rank 7th in total running back fantasy points per game, but they've ranked top 2 in each of the past 6 seasons. Like you said, Ingram's getting a ton of work as well. The matchup kind of lends itself more towards the pass-catching running back, but Ingram has 20 targets to Kamara's 26. That's not exactly chump change. And in a game Vegas suspects New Orleans to win pretty convincingly, I definitely expect him to see the majority of the work, and he's cheaper on DraftKings as well. I think he is the chalk this week. I'm fine with you playing Kamara as well, but definitely prefer Ingram. Outside of that, there's a bunch of cheap guys who are somewhat in play. Elijah McGuire potentially, though Matt Forte practiced today. Andre Ellington really seeing a massive workload over the past 3 weeks, where he ranks 5th in targets, 7th in expected fantasy points. Also draws a very favorable matchup. Tampa Bay surrendering the 5th most receiving fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Who are some other cheaper running backs you're on this week, Tyler?
Well, before we go on, let me circle back to that Ellington call. Are you concerned about the potential volume now with Adrian Peterson in town?
Yeah, like I said when I was recommending Palmer, I could definitely see myself just blowing a gasket over them handing Adrian Peterson 20 carries and he totals maybe 45 rushing yards. But I'm not too concerned. The matchup still bodes really well for him. They're 2-point underdogs, and I think even if volume shrinks a little bit, we know Peterson's not going to get much work as a receiver. He's still a value in my estimation.
Yeah, I completely agree. I was just kind of curious. I wanted to bounce it off you. I remember audibly yelling at my TV this past week. Every time they gave Chris Johnson the ball, it just seemed like a wasted snap, and I feel like they're going to continue the same with Adrian Peterson. I don't think it'll cut into Ellington much. It'll mostly just make Chris Johnson irrelevant, which he already was. As far as other cheap plays, though, I kind of like Jerick McKinnon again. We saw him go off last week against the Bears on national television. He destroyed their linebackers in space, and they're just a complete mess now, dealing with a ton of injuries. He's priced at $4,100, which is very cheap. Again, we didn't see that price change due to the late viewing of the game. As such, I think McKinnon is a very interesting play at $4,100, along with his other punts.
Yeah, heading into this week, I was thinking Jerick McKinnon was something of a trap play. Chicago was without 5 of their top linebackers. Literally 98% of their linebacker snaps last season were not on the field by the end of the game. But again, the matchup does bode well against a Green Bay team where they're likely to go pass heavy. But that point about the linebackers brings me to Javorius Allen, who I also think is a strong play. Surprisingly, he ranks 13th among running backs in expected fantasy points per game. Terrence West is likely out for this week's game. Though Alex Collins has been far superior as a runner in terms of efficiency, he's still not getting much volume to be concerned. Interestingly enough, Allen is averaging 18.7 carries per game and 4.0 targets per game in victories, and 5 carries per game and 6 targets per game in losses, but Vegas suspects Ravens win this game fairly easily as 6.5 point home favorites.
Yeah, I really, really like that play. The only team that's allowed more rushing touchdowns this season is the Rams. I think the Bears could just be completely run on considering the state of their defense. They're just facing a lot of injuries.
And that poor linebacker core can only help Allen as a receiver. But what were you saying about the more expensive running backs on this slate?
Oh, yeah. I was getting there. Switching gears to the running backs. This week lines up for a lot of the really high-priced running backs to fall into great matchups. Le'Veon Bell and Kareem Hunt are going to be facing each other. We're going to see Leonard Fournette and Todd Gurley face each other. I think all 4 of these guys are in play, as well as Melvin Gordon, Devonta Freeman. It's really tough to narrow down which ones you want, so I kind of want to spread my exposure around. One guy that I'm certainly going to try to have more exposure on than the field is Leonard Fournette. I'm just trying to ride the hot hand here. He's averaging 21.8 carries per game, 3.6 targets per game. He's third among all running backs in terms of DK scoring on the year, averaging 22.9 points per game. The Rams are allowing the most rushing touchdowns, as I just alluded to. Zeke, Chris Thompson, and Carlos Hyde all scored at least 24 points against them. Jacksonville leads the league in run play percentage of 55.2%. We're seeing them continue to hide Blake Bortles, and it's working. The Jaguars are just killing it with a great rushing offense and terrific defense. We're getting back to basics here. We're going to see a guy who's playing at home as a current 2.5 home favorite at seeing significant volume. I just think you're overthinking it if you don't want to play Fournette.
Absolutely great call. He ranks 3rd among running backs in expected fantasy points per game, 3rd in actual fantasy points per game, top 4 in carries inside the 5, 10, and 20-yard lines. Jacksonville is running the ball 55% of the time, most in the league, and I think that'd be most since 2013. Really just an absurd rate. Like you said, he's getting a Rams defense that's allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. We talked about this on last week's podcast. I think Wade Phillips just, is fine getting beat on the ground, and he just sells out to stop whatever the offense tries to do through the air. The Rams rank, again, last in rushing fantasy points per game, but ranked 14th best last season. And we see with the Broncos this year, they rank best in rushing fantasy points per game, but 22nd best last year. And I can't help but think that has something to do with Wade Phillips and the sort of scheme he runs. But then on the other side of the ball, you have Todd Gurley, who ranks 3rd among all players in expected fantasy points per game. He's up against a Jaguars defense that ranks best in opposing passer rating, but 2nd worst in yards per carry allowed to opposing running backs. Just the dream run funnel matchup that we wish we saw Pittsburgh go run heavy against. Instead, they let Ben Roethlisberger throw 5 picks against them, but I have a feeling Gurley is heavily involved and has a very nice fantasy game.
Yeah, I'm hoping Sean McVay doesn't outthink himself and do what Mike Tomlin did last week. Just run the ball with Gurley. The other 2 running backs, Le'Veon Bell and Kareem Hunt, I think are in absolute smash spots. They're going to be great options in cash and tournaments. They have both high floors, high ceilings. Honestly, you could pick whichever one, and I think you'll have a great outing with either one.
Yeah, Hunt as well is in an ideal run funnel spot. After seeing some tough matchups recently, the Steelers rank 4th best in opposing passer rating, but 4th worst in opposing running back yards per carry. DeMarco Murray's sort of interesting. The team should be heavy favorites if Marcus Mariota returns. They're playing at home. He saw 83% of the snaps last week. I don't think a lot of people are going to be on him, though that kind of committee situation with Derrick Henry no longer appears to be the case. I also like C.J. Anderson, and I like stacking him with Denver's defense. I think it's almost a near lock the New York Giants score less than 10 points, maybe even probably get shut out. And they've been sneaky bad against the run. They're giving up the 6th most rushing fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Anderson has 20 carries in 3 of 4 games, and between 2 and 4 targets in each game he's played thus far.
Yeah, we just saw Melvin Gordon go off against the Giants last week. I think CJA is in a terrific spot and a great stack with his defense. Just one thing to note is CJ Anderson's playing on that Sunday night slate. DeMarco Murray's playing on that Monday night slate. So just make sure you're aware of what kind of games you're getting into. It's just one more reason to play the Thursday through Monday slate. We can dive into that later. Do you want to transition into wide receivers here?
Let's do it.
Okay. All right. I'm looking at value. And when I look for value, I'm not necessarily looking for the cheapest guys. I'm looking for anything that I think is in a great matchup that's priced incorrectly. And I think Devontae Adams fits that bill this week at 5,700. He tore it up last week, and I'm going back to the well again. Jordy will likely see that shadow coverage we want to avoid from Xavier Rhodes. Randall Cobb will take on the ageless Terrence Newman. And that'll leave Adams with the ideal matchup on the outside against Trey Waynes. Waynes is someone that we've picked on a lot on this pod. He's terrible. He's allowed the 5th most receptions, the 7th most receiving yards in coverage to start the year. He's allowing 0.36 fantasy per route covered. That's 8th worst among all boundary corners. He's currently our 90th ranked cornerback out of 109 qualifying. Adams is averaging 7.8 targets per game and has scored 4 touchdowns in 5 games. I'm going to let this guy eat. Just take him as a value play at 5,700.
Good call. Another guy I'm on, and I know it seems I've been on him in each of the past 3 weeks, but that's DeSean Jackson. He's really just seeing immense volume. He ranks 23rd among wide receivers in targets per game, 3rd in air yards per game, 1st in deep targets per game, and 5th in end zone targets per game. Mike Evans gets set to be shadowed by Patrick Peterson, who every week we're off of. I know Jameis Winston likes to target Mike Evans regardless of matchup, but this should set up Jackson for another really favorable cornerback matchup against the slow-footed Justin Bethel, who ran a 4.58 40-yard dash at his combine. Bethel has surrendered 77 fantasy points into his coverage thus far, which ranks 4th worst among all cornerbacks and would rank 7th worst among all wide receivers. Meanwhile, Mike Evans saw just 70 yards on 17 targets the last time he played Arizona.
I love that call. I will take it one step further and take that contrarian approach and take those targets that are going to be covered by Patrick Peterson against Mike Evans and line him up as well in some stacks with DeSean Jackson and Jameis Winston. I think this Bucs offense could do kind of what we saw with Philadelphia last week, where they just went off scoring touchdown after touchdown. And I want a piece of that. I want some game stacks where I'm going Jameis Winston, Mike Evans, DeSean Jackson, Cameron Brate, the Bucs defense, and bringing it back with Fitzgerald or something. DeSean Jackson's someone you want a lot of exposure to. He's that guy who could win you a GPP in any given week. Justin Bethel has been terrible on the outside. He's already allowed touchdown catches of 37 yards, 45 yards, and 59 yards. That's just right up D-Jax's wheelhouse as a big play threat. I don't know what else to say. I think the Bucs are a great play this week.
Right, and all of the Arizona wide receivers are in seemingly ideal matchups. Tampa Bay is giving up the most fantasy points per game to opposing slot wide receivers. Hello, Larry Fitzgerald. The 2nd most fantasy points per game to outside wide receivers. Hello, John Brown, who's egregiously priced. Definitely, like all these guys, like the idea of a game stack. Another guy I'm on that I don't think a lot of people are is Kelvin Benjamin. The Eagles are allowing the most fantasy points per game to wide receivers lined up to their quarterback's left. That's where Kelvin Benjamin runs 53% of his routes. Devin Funchess is missing time with an injury, but it's likely he plays still. Jalen Mills, we talk about it every single podcast, and Kelvin Benjamin's the one projected to spend most of his time against him.
I agree. I think Devin Funchess is also in play here. Aside from that Thursday night game, though, I think there's a ton of different plays you could pursue at the top. I think if you want to spend up, Antonio Brown's in a great matchup here. We're going to see Marcus Peters stay to one side of the field. That means he has a great chance to just run D play after D play against Terrence Mitchell, who's another cornerback we've targeted aggressively here on this pod. He's just been atrocious in coverage, and Antonio Brown has 10-plus catch upside every single week. I don't think it's matchup dependent considering what we just saw him do against Jacksonville.
Right. Brown had 10 receptions for 172 yards and 2 touchdowns on 16 targets against the Chiefs last year. He's projected to run 53% of his routes from the left side of the field, which is where Kansas City has been far more vulnerable. That's not Peters' side of the field. Last season, the Chiefs allowed the second most fantasy points per game to wide receivers running routes from the left, and they're allowing the third most this season. So definitely an ideal matchup, and he's likely to run an even higher percentage routes from that side of the field to avoid Marcus Peters. I think Juju Smith-Schuster might be a sneaky play. He's played on 78% of his snaps, has seen 15 targets over the last 3 weeks. He's up against Phillip Gaines, who was our fourth worst graded cornerback last year and is our single worst graded cornerback this year.
Yeah, I love that call. He's out snapping Martavis Bryant. He's outplaying him. We're seeing these little trickery plays with some shovel passes for Juju to get involved. It's very entertaining, the plays that they draw up for Juju. If I'm looking for another cheap play, I don't know, man. It's kind of tough at cheap punts. I do not like the way this week shapes up down there. What are you looking at, cheap guys?
I think Roger Lewis is legitimately in play if Sterling Shepard sits. He's the team's wide receiver one. Amari Cooper is only at 5,000 with Derek Carr returning. I think he's going to draw a tough cornerback matchup in Casey Hayward. I think he does shadow. But still, that's a cheap price. I know he's underperformed, but he's at least in consideration. I don't know how much I'll end up with him. There's still some other higher priced guys I'm really into though. I like T.Y. Hilton. Despite last week's soft matchup against the 49ers, Hilton has had one of the toughest cornerback schedules to start the year. 34% of his targets have come against top 25 graded cornerbacks. That ranks fourth most. And he gets a very soft matchup this week against a Titans defense surrendering their most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Logan Ryan is pretty good, and he mans the slot. But Hilton's only going to be there about 35% of the time. He's not a full-time slot wide receiver like he was last year. He'll get a Dory Jackson, our eighth most targeted quarterback, and LaShawn Sims, who's allowing a passer rating of 121.7 into his coverage.
I love the call. I really like that call. I think you can make some really good lineups with rostering the players around that salary. Some other like mid-priced, higher-priced guys I'm into are some slot guys like Golden Tate and Jarvis Landry. The way to attack New Orleans is through the middle of the field, which is why I really like Golden Tate here. Kenny Vaccaro has been covering their slot 93% of the time. He's allowing 2.02 yards per route covered. That's the third worst in the league. I think we're going to see a massive bounce-back game from Golden Tate, who disappointed a lot of people, including myself, last week. But I'm going back to the well. I think he's in a great matchup.
Right, and with Kenny Golladay coming back, he is going to be moved back to the slot, his natural home, where he's probably better and draw that favorable matchup.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting seeing Marshawn Lattimore, who's expected to cover Marvin Jones this week. So I think we'll see a lot less targets going his direction. Maybe focus the attention of the passing offense towards the center of the field. Maybe get Eric Ebron involved instead of Darren Fells. Well, we'll see about that. But circling back to Jarvis Landry, I think he's another great play against slot cornerback Brian Poole. Landry was the only relevant player from that Dolphins game last week outside of their defense. Their passing offense just fell off a cliff. Jay Cutler failed to reach 100 yards passing. I can't recall the last time I've seen a starter do that throughout 4 quarters of play. Landry, on the other hand, though, I think he could salvage some fantasy outcome from this, where he started the year with 15, 11, 7, and 10 targets in their 4 games played so far. Atlanta is currently an 11.5 point home favorite, as we alluded to earlier. That means there's going to be a ton of garbage time points for Jarvis Landry here. And that means a lot of action for Landry against Poole. Poole's allowed 18 of 24 targets against him to be caught, 75%. He's allowing the third most receiving yards out of the slot. And the last time I checked, garbage time fantasy points are still fantasy points. So I'll still be rostering Landry.
Right, Landry does draw the superior matchup over Parker, but I'm going to still have some exposure to Parker. He was just seeing an absurd workload prior to his injury. That's assuming he does play. I also like Stephon Diggs and Adam Thielen. Thielen put up 44.6 and 8.1 fantasy points against Green Bay last year. Diggs put up 33.2 and 12.9 fantasy points against them last year. Packers have our 4th worst graded pass coverage defense after grading out last in the league last season.
I like that call a lot. It just depends on the health status of Diggs. It's definitely something to monitor this week. And it also depends on the status of Case Keenum and Sam Bradford. I think that's going to be a massive call depending on how much exposure I want to that game, because both those wide receivers are in great matchups. Another guy I think that's a fun play from a narrative-based perspective is Pierre Garçon, going against his former team now, with both Garçon and Kyle Shanahan going back to Washington. That team is going to need to pass a lot. Current spread for that game is 10.5 points in favor for the Redskins. I think this is a bounce-back game for the Redskins where they just run the ball like crazy. They get out to an early lead after passing on the 49ers, and then we see Garçon pick up a lot of fantasy points in the second half.
And on the other side of the ball, every single Washington Redskins wide receiver draws a favorable matchup, as San Francisco's 3 starting cornerbacks all grade out among our 11 worst. I have one more guy on my list, and that's Chris Hogan. Every week in my rankings I had Cooks above Hogan, but finally it's time I've moved Hogan ahead. He ranks 10th among wide receivers in expected fantasy points per game, while Cooks ranks just 37th. Hogan has seen 2 targets inside the top 5, 5 targets inside the top 10, 9 targets inside the 20-yard line, and 6 end zone targets so far. All of that ranks among the top 5 among all wide receivers. Meanwhile, Cooks hasn't had a single target inside the red zone. All season so far, Cooks has drawn the tougher cornerback matchup. I don't think that changes this week. He should be shadowed by Morris Claiborne, who has shadowed Amari Cooper, Devontae Parker, Marquise Lee, and Ricardo Lewis. He ranks 13th best in fantasy points allowed per route and coverage. But on the opposite side of him, which is where Hogan should be for the majority of the day, he'll draw Buster Screen, who ranks 7th worst in fantasy points allowed per target.
I like that Hogan call a lot. I also like Danny Amendola too if you're trying to go that route as well. Amendola's coming off 2 games where he caught 6 balls out of 7 targets, and then he went 8 for 8 last week, picking up at least 15 points in each outing. I think he's another PPR option.
That's going to depend a lot for me on whether or not Rob Gronkowski plays, where he gets a nice little boost if Gronkowski's out. Did you have any more wide receivers you wanted to talk up, or move to tight ends?
No, let's keep it moving. Let's head to the tight end position.
First guy at the top of my list is a guy we've talked about a bunch over the past few weeks, Evan Engram, who ranks 6th among tight ends in expected fantasy points, 5th in targets, 1st in routes run at the position. We know the Giants are a complete mess. They've lost Odell Beckham Jr., Dwayne Harris, and Brandon Marshall to season-ending injuries. That was just last week. Sterling Shepard was seen in a walking boot. He's questionable for Sunday's game. Ultimately, the Giants will be without at least 3 or 4 of their top 4 wide receivers. The Broncos are allowing the 6th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, and Ingram seems poised for a big game as the literally only healthy receiving option on this team. He could even get more work as a wide receiver, getting lined up outside and in the slot.
Yeah, it's a shame it's not on the main slate, because I think we could see a ton of ownership there for Evan Engram. As such, I'm looking to either pay up at Gronk or pay down at the tight end position, and I think the best way to pay down is probably at 2,900 Zach Miller. He was a guy who was all over last year, and I'm excited he's back as a fantasy relevant tight end once again. He's coming off a 7-target game where he caught 3 for 39 in a score with new quarterback Mitch Trubisky. Trubisky was fun to watch last week. I'm not going to lie. It was very entertaining seeing him get out on some rollouts and what that offense was able to do. The volume that Miller was seeing, those 7 targets, was also very encouraging, where we're expecting Chicago to pass again this week against Baltimore. The Bears are currently a 6.5-point road dog, and I'm going to be chasing that 27% target market share that Miller had last week, considering he's bargain bin priced down at just 2,900. If I'm looking at another cheap tight end, I'm going to go back to the well of targeting tight ends versus Cleveland. Ryan Griffin comes into play here. I think it's automatic at this point to target tight ends versus the Browns. They're allowing the most receptions and second most touchdowns to the position. Their opponents are scoring a touchdown on 85.7% of their red zone trips allowed. That's the highest rate in the league. Houston is a 10-point home favorite with an implied team total of 28.25 points. Griffin is splitting time with Steven Anderson, so he's not really a slam dunk here for cash game consideration, but he is in play for tournaments. The Browns have allowed 4 of their first 5 opponents to have a tight end finish with at least 14.9 DraftKings points or higher.
I wrote up Zach Miller as well. I like that call. I didn't go too in depth at the tight end position just because I recently found out I'm terrible at it. If you look at Fantasy Pros, where they calculate how accurate each fantasy ranker is, I'm like top 30 in quarterbacks, top 30 in running backs, top 30 in wide receivers, and then like 108th at the tight end position. So I'm just going to let you convince me what the good plays are. Don't have too much written up. I did add Hunter Henry's name to my list. He's PFF's 4th highest graded tight end, where Antonio Gates ranks just 78th. He hit season highs in snaps, targets, and routes last week. First time all year he ran more routes than Antonio Gates. And he draws Oakland, which is supposedly a great tight end matchup, but I did some I dug deeper into it, and there wasn't much to lead me to that conclusion. What do you think?
I was very into the elder statesman Antonio Gates last week, and as we went closer and closer to kickoff, I decided to hedge my play entirely, going all of my Antonio Gates. I split 50-50 with Hunter Henry, and I am very glad I did. Hunter Henry just completely went off. We saw, I think it was 8 targets last week. I think he's a great play I think he's a great play again this week. And don't feel discouraged about that tight end ranking. Tight end fantasy points all comes down to just a touchdown. Did the guy score or not? It's so fickle. It's so hard to guess. So what we should do is target high-scoring games where we think the tight ends have an option of scoring. As such, another guy I'm going to look for is Cameron Brate. I'm just going to pile onto my Tampa Bay love this week. Arizona just let Zach Ertz pick up 6 catches for 61 yards and a touchdown on 12 targets last week. Brate leads the team with 3 touchdowns so far this year, where 6 of his 22 targets have come from inside the red zone. They're using him down there to score. He's out targeting and out snapping, running more routes than O.J. Howard. I just think Brate's a slam dunk play here, and I think he's in cash consideration as well.
Good calls. Do you have anyone else for me, Tyler?
Nah, I think that's about it. We'll see about the health status of Travis Kelce. It's kind of tough to gauge right now. One positive news was Rob Gronkowski's back at practice, so if I pay up, I think he's a great play here. One thing we should mention is ASJ. I think we're seeing him get a ton of volume. Playing against the Patriots, they're going to have to pass a lot. I think he's also in play as well this week.
What about George Kittle? Are you buying into the George Kittle hype? Because I kind of am.
I'm very undecided. Like, he's running a ton of routes. He's getting a ton of action. But I'm just indecisive about it, and I can't understand why. They're definitely going to need to pass again. This week, they're massive road dogs, 10.5 points, as we already talked about. I get it if you want to play him. I don't know how much exposure I'm going to have to him, though.
Right.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So just
awesome
very indecisive about George Kittle. Okay. So play Kittle if you like him. Is that our consensus here?
Pretty much, yeah. This was a weird podcast. I feel good about my takes. Do you want to move on to defense before we call it a day?
Yeah, I think that unlike last week, it was kind of difficult to pick a defense. The really good plays were just basically picking on Matt Castle with the Dolphins. There's 20 DraftKings points there. This week, I think there's a bigger pool of teams that should warrant your consideration. I like Atlanta taking on Cutler at home. I like the Jaguars taking on Goff. Kansas City at home against the Big Ben on the road. Houston versus Cleveland. New England versus the Jets. I'm willing to go there. The New England defense is terrible so far, but I think this Jets offense is worse. And then the Denver defense as well. I don't think this New York Giants team will field an offense this week. There's just a lot of options at the defensive position.
Right. I'm also on Houston. I love Baltimore this week against a rookie quarterback. They've played extremely well at home of late and really over the past 4 or 5 seasons. If Derek Carr doesn't play, if Marcus Mariota's out, I'm targeting the defense is playing them. But far and away, greatest play of the week, and I know it's expensive, but still is Denver. I wouldn't be surprised if there's multiple defensive touchdowns, perhaps even safeties, plenty of sacks. I think these shut out the Giants. This Giants offense is atrocious and will especially be atrocious without Odell Beckham Jr., without Brandon Marshall, likely without Sterling Shepard. So Eli's out there throwing passes to 3 wide receivers he has limited experience with, who have rarely ever stepped on an NFL football field. Just a dream smash spot for probably one of the top 3 best defenses in the league.
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough for the Giants now. Do you have any bold takes for this week to wrap things up?
Well, my bold take last week was pretty terrible, so I do not.
Okay, I'll give you a mild one and then a hot one just to cover ground here. The mild one, we'll say Amari Cooper gets back on track. He's priced egregiously low at $5K. This is a bounce back spot that we've been waiting for with Derek Carr, who's likely to play, I think, 20 plus DraftKings points, and he gets one of those elusive red zone touchdowns that seem to escape his career.
Okay, not too flaming hot.
No, but if we're talking flaming hot, like hot take, fire emoji, like flames like Lil Dicky, I'm thinking Buck Allen finishes as this week's top running back.
Whoa!
Netting 150 yards from scrimmage and 2 touchdowns against the banged up Bears. We've been picking on the Bears this podcast because they're going through a ton of injuries, and I'm going to put my money where my mouth is. I think Buck Allen's the big play of the week.
I like it. I'm going to wussy out here and not give you guys anything. Just read my articles and maybe a hot take or two will pop up somewhere. I'm Scott Barrett, and for Tyler Buecher, thanks so much for tuning in. Please keep sending us your tweets and screenshots of big DFS days. We love to see that. Thank you, everyone, and see you all next week.